Hi, so I am going to continue on with our covenants of the Old Testament. And we've talked about Adam, we talked about Noah, and now we're going to talk about Abraham. Now, originally, Abraham's name was Abram. When God first established a covenant with Abram, he came to Abram, he had noted that Abram was a very good and just individual, and he extended a covenant bond with him. What's important to remember about covenants is an extension of family relationship to someone who is not your family. So God is, again, reaching for humanity, even though we continue to break our covenants and we continue to disappoint him with our behavior. I say disappoint him. We just continue to do what people do. We continue to sin. God continues to reach out for him. So he reaches for Abram and he establishes a covenant with him. So what Abram does is he takes several animals. He takes a dove and a ram and some other animals, cuts them in half, divides them, lights them on fire, and walks through it. The terminology for creating a covenant is to cut a covenant. Something gets cut or killed in the sealing of a covenant. So what Abram is saying in this moment is, if I break my covenant with you, God, let what happened to these animals happen to me. So God establishes, there's always a promise with a covenant. And the promise that Abram had from God was, you are going to have so many descendants, you won't be able to count them. And from your seed, the Messiah will come. From your seed, the Messiah will come. This is historically important. This is something that the Jews would have read this story in the temple. They would have understood that, okay, when the Messiah comes, he has to be a blood relative to Abram. So keep that in the back pocket. So what God promises Abram is, you will have so many descendants, you won't be able to count them. Now, that's all well and good, but Sarai and Abram are old. They're in their, probably around their 70s, and they have no children. So when Abram goes back and he tells Sarai, he was like, yeah, I made a covenant with God. God said we were going to have so many descendants that we wouldn't be able to count them. So Sarai is like, I'm old, can't have children. Take my slave girl and have a child with her. So Abram was like, okay, sounds good. And he does it. And Hagar, the slave girl, ends up having Ishmael. Now, Sarai is completely enraged and jealous that her slave girl was able to have a baby. And the relationship that she has with her is extremely abusive and hostile. But God, being who God is and promising to care for Abram's descendants, he cares for Ishmael. And this is actually where the Muslims, their religion comes from, is they follow Ishmael because Ishmael was born to Hagar. Now, in this, Abram and Sarai have broken the covenant with God, because basically what they did was, God promises that I'm going to have a child. God can't do that. So they took matters into their own hand. And so the lack of faith and the lack of trusting that they had for God broke their covenant. So Abram and God are speaking to each other again, and they need to commit a new covenant. As we said with the first covenant, when Abram walked through the animals, he was saying, if I break my covenant with you, God, do to me what I did to these animals. Now the covenant is different, and it has to be cut again. The difference this time is that Abram has to cut himself. So this is where circumcision comes in. Now every single male under this covenant must be circumcised. And this is something that the Jews still do today. They have a bris after a baby is born, and they celebrate the circumcision, the rejoining of this covenant. So at the circumcision of Abram, God changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. And, Abram still receives the exact same promises, even though he originally broke the first covenant. From your descendant, the Messiah will come. You'll have so many descendants, they will outnumber the stars. And it turns out that Sarah ends up getting pregnant, and she has Isaac. Now, when Isaac is he's in his teen years, God comes to Abraham again, and he says, sacrifice your child to me. This is the most confused story in the Bible. And theologians today still argue about what exactly happened here. Now, I'm going to give you my understanding of it as best I can, but there's other avenues that you can go to kind of explore this covenant more, because it's so interesting. Now, Abraham is a new person. That's what happens when people get a new name. It's showing that they are a new person, just like Saul, who used to murder Christians, became Paul. He is a completely new creation. Abraham is also, and he is now a fully trusting man of faith who understands, like, God, I didn't trust that you could do all things the first time. You're telling me to sacrifice my son. I know that I'm supposed to have descendants that outnumber the stars. Something I don't understand is going to happen here, but I'm going to trust you. So he takes his son, he travels to the mountain, the place where he is supposed to sacrifice his son, travels up the mountain with Isaac. But there are parallels here that you have to recognize. Isaac is referred to as the beloved son, the only begotten son, the firstborn son, the exact same way that Jesus is referred to, the beloved son, the firstborn son, the only begotten son. And what happens here, Isaac is a teenager and Abraham is old, like in his 90s old. And I can tell you that if I was a teenager and I did not want to die, and a 90-year-old was saying, carry this wood up this mountain so I can kill you, I would fight him. So something so interesting is happening here where Isaac is a willing sacrifice. So imagine the image of this teenage boy carrying wood on his back up a mountain to be sacrificed. The one that is referred to as the only begotten and beloved son. That should be ringing a bell in your head and saying, oh my gosh, this is Jesus. This is pointing to Jesus. Now, ultimately, when they get to the top of the mountain and Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac, God tells him to stop because Isaac is not the correct sacrifice. We all know who the correct sacrifice ends up being later on, and it's not Isaac. So from Abraham, the Messiah will be a descendant. This is, again, the historical noting of who Abraham was needs to be taken into consideration, because this means that Jesus is going to parallel what happened in the story because Isaac wasn't the correct sacrifice. And second, Jesus has to be a direct descendant of Abraham, like a biological descendant. So we will continue on with this. We'll talk about Moses next week. Have a great day.